In Chapter 8, our goal is to learn about sampling distributions in basic statistics. Why do we need to learn about sampling distributions? What concepts or what kind of problems do we intend to solve by learning about sampling distributions? Let us begin. On page 2, we have some introductory thoughts. So here is a thought for you. Suppose the government wanted to determine the mean income of all US households. One approach the government could take is to survey every US household to determine the population mean. That would be represented by mu. Well, one fact is clear. That would be a very expensive and time-consuming survey. But here is another approach that the government actually does take. They survey a random sample of US households and use the results to take a guess or estimate the mean household income. So rather than take every US household, they can take just about a random sample. Now, the current population survey is administered to approximately a sample size of 250,000 randomly selected US households each month. Among the questions on the survey, respondents are asked to report the income of each individual in the household. And using this information, the federal government obtains a sample mean household for a sample mean household income for US households. For example, in 2013, it was found that the mean annual household income in the United States was estimated to be $72,641. What might the government use, this information for? They might use it to guess or infer or deduce that based on the results of this survey, that the mean annual income of all US households in that year, 2013, was $72,641. Take note that the households that made it into the current population survey were determined by chance. And this is associated with a concept we learned earlier in the semester called random sampling. Well, there's something to note. In the first sample that was taken, they found that the average was $72,641 based on 250,000 randomly selected US households. Here's a thought for you. Do you think that if they selected a second random sample of households, it could be of the same 250,000 US households, would they have exactly the same households? Well, I would guess to the contrary, that they will not. And that means that if they have different households that are being surveyed in this survey, it will likely lead to a different sample mean. And that could be, let's say, $71,849, which is different from what they guessed or estimated earlier. What if the process continues and they took a third random sample of households? This would lead to a third sample mean, such as 72,978. Something becomes clear, that the more samples that are being selected, there will be variabilities in the estimated mean annual household income. And that is because the households that will be in that survey will vary from one sample to another. And so, as a result, the sample mean that will be estimated based on each of these samples will also vary from one sample to another. So for this reason, the sample mean, that is the average that you get based on each data you collect in a sample, is a random variable. It is a variable or a quantity that changes from one sample to another. And in statistics, whenever we have a variable that varies from one sample to another or from one observation to another, we say that it has a probability distribution. What does that mean? It means it has a set of possible values, and associated with each of the set of possible values are the frequencies or likelihood of occurrence of each of those possible values. Our goal in this chapter is to describe how the values of a sample mean can vary from one sample to another, and also the sample proportion. Remember, whenever we describe a population, be it for just a regular random variable or for the sample mean, we must describe it in terms of its shape, the center, and the spread. Still on this concept, let us see some basic real-life problems or questions that we hope to answer at the end of this discussion or at the end of this treatment of this chapter. The director of tourism in a Caribbean country conducted a study that showed that the mean daily expenditure for adults visitors to the country is $318.69. This means that on average, a typical person or a typical adult visitor to the country spends $318.69. Where did this value come from? Well, we are told that this mean value that we just obtained of $318.69 is based on a statistical sample of data collected from only 780 adult visitors. Since this is a number that comes from just a sample, we can say that that number, which provides information about the sample, is a statistic. Remember, a statistic is a numerical number or a numerical summary of a sample drawn from a population of interest. And so it is not a parameter which describes the entire population. And based on this earlier discuss, we can say again, $318.69 is a statistic, not a parameter, because it is based on a sample data rather than an entire population. However, if you were this director of tourism, this official, you might have some questions. The actual average amount of money or average daily, the mean daily expenditure for adult visitors, if you had collected data for every adult visitor that had ever visited that country before, would the average still be $318.69? Remember, that is exactly the real quantity you want to estimate. But since collecting data from all visitors might be impossible, you have decided to settle for a sample, a random sample if possible. So the question continues, that is the actual average population mean equal to this $318.69? That is a big question that might still be asked. Or, well, based on what we have seen, that from one sample to another, the average can change. That is, the sample average or sample mean can change. So it means that there is a possibility that this $318.69 might not be actually the overall population mean that is unknown that we seek to estimate. So if that population mean is not this value we got from the sample, our interest might be how close is this our guess or estimate based on the sample at hand to the true but unknown population mean. We might even ask another question. Is a sample of 780 taken from a population of almost 2 million annual visitors to the country sufficient to give us a good idea of the population mean? Statisticians will say, is it sufficient to provide a good enough estimate of the population mean? Then again, if we randomly sample or draw another statistical sample of 780 visitors, do you think we will get exactly the same mean daily expenditure of $318.69? These kind of questions are the kind of questions that statisticians seek to answer when we gather data. Let's see another example. A furniture manufacturer that makes made-to-assemble furniture kits selects a random sample of kits boxed and ready for shipment to customers. These boxes or these kits are unboxed and inspected to see whether what is in the box matches exactly what is supposed to be in the box. This past week, 150 kits were sampled and 15 had one or more discrepancies. Calculate the percentage or proportion of defectives or the defect rate. So the defect rate or the proportion of defectives, same thing, will be out of the 150 kits, we had 15 that had discrepancies. So that leads us to 0.1, which is same as 10%. This is the percentage or the proportion of defectives. There are other questions worth considering based on this observation. Do you think the quality engineer should conclude that since this sample of 150 kits had 10%, that exactly 10% of the 6,900 furniture kits made since the first of the year and reached the customer with one or more other discrepancies? That is this 10% reflective of what is going on in the general population of all 6,900 furniture kits? Or other questions. Do you think the actual percentage is higher than 10% or lower than 10%? And if so, by how much? Should the quality engineer request that more furniture kits be sampled? Is the sample size of 150 kits large enough to get a good estimate? How many more should be sampled? These are potential questions that we can answer using statistical methods or the methods that we will learn in this chapter. With these introductory thoughts in mind, I believe we are ready to explore sampling distributions. Let us begin.